Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Norris, and I'm a research assistant on the Shale Innovation Project at the Ohio University Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. On behalf of all my colleagues at Ohio University, I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our continuing series of webinars focused on Ohio's evolving energy landscape. Today's webinar, entitled Severance Taxes and Wealth Retention in Shale Country, is made possible by an Ohio University Innovation Strategy grant, which highlights interdisciplinary research. The task before us in today's webinar is to discuss the role that severance taxes play in capturing and retaining wealth from oil and gas activity. Our expert panel of speakers will discuss the current status of state-based severance taxes across the U.S. and summarize the current policy debate. Our discussion today incorporates research activities from the Ohio Shale Innovation Project, which is using an interdisciplinary approach to study the economic, environmental, engineering, and policy trade-offs that drive resource extraction. This collaboration between the College of Arts and Sciences, the Russ College of Engineering and Technology, and the Voinovich School aims to develop a deeper understanding of how to help build a more robust and resilient regional economy. During today's webinar, you can submit questions for our panelists at any time during the session using the question field on the GoToWebinar navigation pane. Following the presentations, we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during our time today. As always, a recording of this webinar and a downloadable version of our presenters' slide decks will be available at ohio.edu/ce3 by week's end. This information will also be emailed to participants. If you enjoy this webinar, I invite you to keep an eye out for our announcement on upcoming ones in 2018, which we are currently planning. Also, we would like to put on your radar our 2018 Shale Symposium, tentatively planned for April 2018. At the symposium, we will share results from our interdisciplinary research going into its third year. With that, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to our attendees on the line, and especially to our panel of experts for sharing their time and perspectives with us today. To start, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Dan Carney. Dr. Carney is an assistant professor of economics at Ohio University with an expertise in energy economics. Dr. Carney, please take it away.
Thank you, Jonathan. Welcome to all that have joined today, including those on the line and our panelists. I'll now be introducing our panelists in the order that they are presenting. Each will present for approximately 15 minutes. To begin, we have Wendy Patton, a Senior Project Director at Policy Matters Ohio. Wendy focuses on state budget and taxation issues. Wendy will present on the current state of energy production and associated severance taxes and other fees in Ohio. Next, we have Ted Botner, the Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. Ted is an expert on permanent funds to facilitate sustainable economic growth. This will be a major topic of Ted's presentation today. Last but not least, we have Daniel Ramey, and he will deliver his remarks. Daniel is a senior research associate at Resources for the Future, lecturer at the University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and faculty affiliate at the University of Michigan Energy Institute. Daniel will show the cross-state variation in oil and gas severance taxes and fees, along with the flow of that revenue. Daniel also has a new book coming out titled The Fracking Debate. As a reminder, during today's webinar, please submit your questions for our panelists in the GoToWebinar question pane. I will be collecting those questions and then moderating a Q&A at the end of the presentations. Now we're going to turn to our first presenter. Take it away, Wendy.
Thank you, Dr. Carney. My comments today and my slides have to do with Ohio's production of oil and gas, our severance tax, and our need for resources to deal with the effects of the industry. Next slide, please. I am with Policy Matters Ohio. We're a nonprofit policy research institute with the mission of creating a more vibrant, equitable, sustainable, and inclusive Ohio. Next slide, please. It's new technology that's driving Ohio's oil and gas industry. Ohio had a mature industry prior to the commercialization of hydraulic fracturing technology or fracking. The oil and gas industry was very old. The oil industry actually peaked in the 1890s in Ohio. The natural gas industry peaked in the 1980s. Like other states, Ohio placed a severance tax on oil and gas in the 1970s, but unlike other states, it's not been changed or updated. As production grows rapidly today, we're still taxing oil and gas like it was a depleted old industry of the past instead of a new and robust sector. Next slide, please. This slide gives you a visual image, really, of the trends in natural gas production and oil production in Ohio through 2016, and it's taken from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, really excellent database. Production of natural gas, you see, continues to rise very steeply. Oil production's not as strong. Several years ago, in testimony to the legislature, the Industry Trade Association pointed out that the part of the Utica shale play that produces oil is shallow, and the technology at that point of time, they pointed out, it doesn't yet allow as fruitful a harvest as you can get with natural gas. The industry expected technology to change to be better able to get at Ohio's oil reserves in the future. I think they said within the next decade. But I think what we see is there's been a little bit of a drop-off in oil production, although it's higher than it was clearly so when the industry started fracking in Ohio in 2011. But the natural gas production remains very strong. Next slide. This slide takes a close look at the employment trends related to oil and gas. It shows how the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services defines the core industries of oil and gas production. They take a very broad view. It encompasses extraction, which is the actual getting the oil and gas out of the ground, but it goes beyond that to include drilling, support activities, oil field service activities, pipeline construction, and pipeline transportation. You can see in these numbers over time, employment has shifted from the conventional definition of oil and gas extraction, which is NAIC 211, to the other components of what they define as core industries. The employment directly in oil and gas extraction has fallen as production has matured a bit over the last 5-6 years, but other types of jobs, the oil field services and pipeline construction, have grown. Now, the Trade Association, the Ohio Oil and Gas Energy Education Program, sees a lot more. They say in the most recent publication from their website, recent data from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services shows that Ohio's natural gas and crude oil industry employs 13,473 direct jobs and 283 indirect jobs. In total, in comparison, in 2010, there was a total of 13,000 jobs. Their definitions are extraordinarily broad, particularly of indirect industries, encompassing steel, air and water administration, real estate leasing, highway, street, and bridge construction. It paints an extraordinarily rosy view, we'd say an unrealistically rosy view. We work with other states in the Appalachian shale play to understand employment trends and economic activity. We've studied the positive aspects and the negative aspects of the oil and gas production in our states. We work together through the Multi-State Shale Research Collaborative. Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia have long histories with coal and now oil of the natural resource curse, in which there is wealth created for a few, but it leaves the legacy of environmental degradation and poverty in the wake of a boom. The sharp decline of shale employment in Pennsylvania in the 12 months following the fourth quarter of 2012 reminds us that resource extraction has rarely provided a sustainable and reliable route to regional prosperity. Policymakers in shale-rich regions should view employment projections with caution and recognize that even robust gains are quickly reversed. This said, there has been significant investment in the Southeast Ohio economy with the expansion of the oil and gas industry through fracking. Cleveland State University's Energy Center estimates royalties of $1.7 billion were paid between 2011 and 2016. They estimate $38 billion was spent on land costs, real estate development, well pad construction, and other what they refer to as upstream production processes. In terms of midstream investments, they identify $8.1 billion spent over the same time frame in the construction of transmission, processing, gathering lines, and rail terminals. Now, downstream investment is harder to quantify. They quantify it in terms of large users. So far, we haven't seen ethylene crackers and petrochemical production, but our states are working on that and talking to such downstream developers. So that's on the horizon. Okay, factors bearing on the employment levels and the production you have some very positive trends and some less positive trends. Prices have fallen sharply in oil and gas in 2014 and 2015. Wells, however, the fracked wells are much more productive today than they were even 5 or 6 years ago, with the lateral lines extending from about 5,000 feet early on to about 9,000 feet now. Producers have contracts with transmission and processing facilities that they need to fulfill as the infrastructure is built. And as the pipeline and processing infrastructure is built, it opens up new markets with higher prices and more demand to them. There is significant sunk costs in Southeast Ohio, really throughout the region, in terms of land, leases, wells, and the long-term outlook for fossil fuels remains strong. Next slide. Ohio has now become one of the 10 top producing states of natural gas in the nation. In 2016, it ranked number 7, just below Wyoming, a little edging ahead of West Virginia in the natural gas production. If you look at the map on the right of the slide, the production in the Utica play is highlighted, and you can see while there is production of natural gas in West Virginia and in Pennsylvania from this particular productive play, it's really concentrated in eastern Ohio. Next slide, please. However, the industry has an effect statewide. This slide presents 2 pictures developed by Frac Tracker that show how the industry leaves a footprint that is statewide. While it's concentrated in the eastern half of the state, it extends north, south, east, and west. In the top slide, you see waste disposal, injection, treatment, and brine processing cluster around Cincinnati. Cincinnati happens to have geology that is it is ideal geology for waste disposal, and the industry is growing there. The picture underneath of the pipeline construction stretches across the state. Really, if you travel the back roads, the 2-lane highways across the state, you frequently will come across pipeline production because it's expanding tremendously right now. There is a statewide footprint, and if you consider the industry effect really relating to those core employment sectors that we saw defined by the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services, you have to think about transportation as well as all these other factors of the industry. You also have to keep in mind that workforce is regional, drawing on professionals in geology, people, the construction trades, statewide and really regionally, the processing facilities. So this is an industry that's having statewide impact. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about the severance tax. I've got some data on this slide that is taken from the testimony of Ohio Budget Director Tim Keene from earlier this year. Director Keene pointed out that in 2015, the value of oil and gas extracted in Ohio was almost $4 billion. The severance tax paid on that extraction of wealth was about $29 million. So the effective tax rate was less than 1%. It was about 7.5% 7.5 of 1%. The severance tax is an ancient form of taxation. It was an early form of taxation established to compensate the king for the value of natural resources extracted forever from his lands. Today, it's just the standard way to cover the external costs of production like air and water pollution and enhanced services like fire and police protection, traffic control, wear and tear on the roads, and to build for a brighter future. Revenue from the severance tax can be used and is frequently used to bolster education and to help diversify the economy. This is particularly important considering the economic boom and bust cycle that occurs with natural resource extraction. This is the paradox of plenty, that a hugely profitable natural resource is stripped from a region, and yet the people of the region are typically left poor, and in many, maybe most places, the land is left degraded. The paradox is that great wealth is garnered from the land, but it doesn't leave the folks better off. It too often damages or ruins the land. Southeast Ohio knows a lot about this from the coal industry, and of course so does Pennsylvania and West Virginia. Next slide, please. Now, our oil and gas industry is no longer your mom and pop's oil and gas industry. But our severance tax is your old mom and pop's severance tax. Ohio's oil and gas severance tax is based on quantity, not value. It's a dime per barrel of oil and 2.5 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. The regulatory cost recovery assessment double the oil assessment to 2 dimes a barrel, and it rises to 3 cents per 1,000 cubic feet on natural gas. But even so, even with the conservation assessments, it's very low. Between 2001 and 2010, we calculate that Ohio's severance tax equated to about 0.4 of 1% of value on natural gas and about 0.2 of 1% on oil. By comparison, the base or stated rate on the severance tax on natural gas is 7.5% in Texas, 6% of value in Wyoming, 7% in Oklahoma, 5% in Arkansas and West Virginia. Next slide, please. This slide looks at collection. It's a comparison of collection of dollars per volume of natural gas across a selection of primary producing states. This was recently compiled by our sister organization in Pennsylvania, the Keystone Institute. Here you can see that tax collections on oil and gas in Ohio are lower than a comparable volume collection taxed in other states. Now, the oil and gas industry protest in testimony to the legislature that they can shift production to other states if Ohio were to impose a more conventional severance tax. It's our belief that oil and gas has certain sensitivities to price, but that geology, potential, quality of the natural resource, and sunk investment matter a whole lot. The oil and gas industry, natural resource industries, do not have the same footloose pattern as factories. Next slide, please. This slide takes a look at the effective tax rate as compared to the stated tax rate. While the stated tax rate on natural gas in Texas is 7.5%, the tax loopholes, tax holidays, tax breaks actually lower the effective rate to something closer to 3.5%. You can see that Ohio, even when you take into consideration all of the tax breaks and tax loopholes in other states, Ohio still remains at the bottom of the barrel in terms of collections. West Virginia, by contrast, has done pretty well at resisting the kinds of loopholes and tax holidays that have been imported from other states and imposed by legislators, reducing the value of the severance tax. So in terms of effective tax rate, Ohio remains the lowest severance tax rate amongst these major producers, collecting even less on the extraction of oil and gas than Pennsylvania, which doesn't have a severance tax. Pennsylvania has a local impact fee, no statewide severance tax, and we are collecting less than Pennsylvania's local fees. Next slide, please. Now, Governor Kasich has tried hard to raise the severance tax on fracked production, not on conventional production, but on the new technology, the frack production. He, in the most recent executive budget, proposed a very straightforward and simple tax, 6.5% on the value of oil and gas at the wellhead, except for liquid natural gases, which would be taxed at 4.5% per 1,000 cubic feet. Again, I want to mention that primary drilling states like Texas have severance taxes as high as 7.5% on natural gas. North Dakota's gross production tax on oil is 5% of the gross value, and then there's an additional fee, the oil extraction tax of 5% of gross value. Alaska's stated tax rate is 25%. New Mexico levies several fees on the industry, including an emergency school tax, ad valorem taxes, a severance tax, and a conservation fee. Ohio's lawmakers never even really considered the governor's severance tax proposal. And you can see that this tax, this simple, straightforward tax would have greatly increased funds brought in on the extraction of oil and gas in Ohio. In 2017, we collected about $30 million on oil and gas. The governor would have brought in about $140 million in 2018 and a little bit north of $300 million in 2019. The legislators never considered this proposal. Governor Kasich has proposed severance taxes in the last 3 budgets, and the legislature has not really considered any one of them. The industry threatens to leave. It positions itself as a footloose industry, but of course, if they left Ohio, they would be leaving valuable resources behind. There's a lot of oil and gas in southeastern Ohio hills and a lot of investment. Next slide, please. Here is the Policy Matters Ohio position on the severance tax. We work with this on our colleagues. We work together with our colleagues in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York, and we also work together with coalition partners within the state. We recommend a 5% severance tax on oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids at the wellhead. Whatever comes out of the well, at the wellhead, that's where you impose the tax. And it should be the same across all products. We oppose any tax breaks, holidays, or loopholes. Hydraulic fracturing is a well-known technology, well-tested by now. We believe that Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia should have the same level of severance tax so as to establish a level playing field so the industry can't play our states off against one another and say that they'll leave Ohio and go to West Virginia or leave Ohio and go to Pennsylvania or whatever. Our governors have agreed to work cooperatively on regional economic development. Tax policy should be an integral part of that strategy. We also advocate for an additional fee for a permanent fund to build wealth for future economic growth after the boom goes bust. Ted will talk more about that today. Next slide, please. So why is the severance tax needed? I'm going to talk very briefly about 4 key reasons that you need a strong and self-respecting severance tax for a state. One has to do with the external cost of production. Another reason has to do with the new infrastructure that is related to the indirect development you get in an oil and gas producing region during a boom. A third is to maintain the enhanced infrastructure that's built to support the industry. And the fourth, and probably most important over time, is to build for a sustainable and diversified economy for the future. Next slide, please. In terms of the external costs, we're looking at air and water pollution within the region. We look at the wear and tear on public infrastructure, the impacts of a migrant workforce that comes in initially, maybe it's national staff of the oil and gas industry or the driller and are there for production and then leave. When they swell a town, they need housing, they need services, and this is an external cost of this industry. Here in Ohio, we have earthquakes. It's an external cost, especially to the insurance industry. And we also have seen spills, environmental crime, like people pouring brine into rivers, and emergencies. Next slide, please. There's a cost of new infrastructure, and this is what is most commonly addressed in legislative hearings. Clearly the industry needs and is building new infrastructure. However, we also need infrastructure for expanded commerce to serve a growing industry and growing population. Roads and turn lanes, water treatment and sewerage, expanded housing, traffic controls, emergency services and equipment, and there are also statewide impacts. Next slide, please. There is then, if you build new infrastructure, there is a cost of maintaining that enhanced infrastructure. The enhanced infrastructure the industry is putting in sometimes requires maintenance the townships, counties, and small communities cannot afford over time. In testimony before the legislature, a township trustee from Southeast Ohio pointed out that the widened road that runs through his township with graveled shoulders now costs more to maintain per mile than the tax base of his township can provide. Who then finances the necessary maintenance? And statewide, we need oversight of pipelines, injection wells, watersheds, and transportation. So all of the costs that are really exaggerated within the region, we have the need for covering those costs on a statewide basis in different areas. And the most important part, which Ted will talk about, has to do with building a sustainable tomorrow. There is no lack of smart, sophisticated economic development professionals throughout southeastern Ohio, and they've come in and told the legislature the kinds of economic development strategies they need to use to build for the future. There are regional needs, but statewide needs as well. As industries rise and fall, each one needs to pay their fair share to ensure stability in the public finance of essential services the workforce needs statewide. Schools and roads and bridges and safety net services in the volatile, churning American economy, amongst other needs. Next slide. The economic development officials and elected leaders and citizen groups who have told Ohio's legislators about the kinds of programs they need a strong severance tax now to finance the kinds of strategies that they talked about that were instituted in the Minnesota Iron Range, which built small businesses and leveraged that growth to expand existing and historical industries, helping them to reach broader markets and stabilizing employment for the long term. Everyone concentrated on the need for better educational benefits for future generations. In Southeast Ohio, the sentiment to protect the land from degradation is particularly strong and well informed. I attached this picture of a hill in Muskingum County. This is from my dad's book. It's his painting. That hill is gone. It's been strip mined away. He and I and many others of Southeast Ohio are doing everything we can to ensure our hills retain their beauty and our kids can have a great future there. And we need a stronger severance tax to achieve these goals. So that is my presentation. Thank you all very much, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Carney.
Thank you very much, Wendy. We're now going to turn it over to Ted Butner from the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy. And just as a reminder, if any of the audience has any questions for our panelists, to please use the question pane in the GoToWebinar platform to submit your questions. I'll be compiling those questions and then asking our presenters after the presentations. So next we have Ted. Take it away.
Hey, Dr. Carney, thank you so much, and it's good to be with you today. As he said, my name is Ted Bettner. I'm the Executive Director of the West Virginia Center on Budget Policy, where we focus on tax and budget issues, economic development, and family economic security in West Virginia. And one of our research areas is also our state's energy sector and how we can ensure that the state benefits from its depleting non-renewable natural resources. So what I'd like to do today is talk about one way that states use their natural resources to build long-term sustainable wealth that is around long after coal, natural gas, oil, and other minerals are long gone. But what I first want to highlight is what we've been working on together across states to pursue policies at the regional level. This is something that Wendy talked about as well. Next slide. So launched in 2013, the West Virginia Center on Budget and Policy, along with Policy Matters Ohio and groups in Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, we formed the Multi-State Shale Research Collaborative in order to produce trend analysis, policy recommendations, and other resources that will help local officials, community leaders respond to local impacts of drilling. And some of the goals of the collaborative was to identify these positive and negative impacts of drilling on communities, some of the things that Wendy went over. Also to really minimize the negative externalities and promotes responsible growth. And one of the overarching themes of the collaborative was to avoid the race to the bottom when it comes to taxes, regulations, and other labor policies. So far, we've written several reports and calls to action, including one in-depth case study that explored impact drilling in several counties in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. We've also, as Wendy talked about, sort of worked to urge our legislators and state and local policymakers to support a unified severance tax. And we've also put together scorecards grading state policies in non-areas, such as whether a state has effective policies in growing in-state shale jobs, mitigating the boom and bust characterization of extraction, ensuring supplies of affordable housing, taxing the shale industry, and also tracking health impacts. One little victory that we had is that
we appear to be having an audio problem here. 1 second, folks, while we resolve it. Ted, we can't hear you right now. Thanks for your patience as we work to resolve this. 1 moment, please.
All right, this is Dr. Carney. So while
I got back online finally.
All right, shall we continue? Are you ready to continue, Ted?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It suddenly got kicked offline for some reason. Yeah, so our collaborator's been working on these things, and one thing that we've been looking at is how to mitigate the natural resource curse and what we can do about it. Can you go to the next slide, please? Some of the observations that we've had on the natural resource curse was first pointed out in a seminal study in 1995 by economists Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner. They compared economic growth rates in about 95 countries, and they found that resource-poor economies often vastly outperform resource-rich economies in economic growth. This work has also been done at the state and local level as well. And some of the problems that Sachs and Warner found, we also found in studies in the United States. So the natural resource course is exactly what Wendy talked about too, is the paradox of plenty. And it refers to looking at the paradox that countries or states with abundant natural resources, tend to have worse outcomes going forward, and some of the negative impacts that they can have, such as Dutch disease or revenue volatility, weak governance is another thing, and also less economic diversity and economic instability in a boom and bust economy. Next slide, please. As I mentioned too earlier, there have been several studies that have found problems with natural resource-based economies. These studies have found that states do not perform as well as others and can lead to a vicious cycle where this means to grow beyond an energy-based economy is strong. And, some things that can happen is you just have unequal growth, especially in the long term, and you can have weak governance. And you can also have other negative impacts through that investment. It tends to sort of push out other industries and lead to lower skills with high wage jobs, but it also tends to push out other industries and creates one type of workforce. Like in West Virginia, a lot of people just decided not to go to college because they could get a pretty good job in the coal mining industry. What ends up happening is you end up having a very a lot of people in the workforce don't have post-secondary degrees, and we can't quite get into the natural or a more knowledge-based economy. And it's a bit of a drag on the state and local economy as well. Next slide, please. And one thing that we did about a year ago, we did a study that was based on a Cleveland Fed Reserve Bank study, and one that was done at the University of Kentucky, where we looked at West Virginia, and we used a whole range of variables to understand why West Virginia lags behind other states' economies. And one of the main things we found in that was that that West Virginia suffered from a resource curse, or a large share of income coming from the mining sector. And another great place to look, I mean, not a great place, but one place to look in West Virginia for a prime example of what happens after a boom and bust is McDowell County, West Virginia. Next slide. McDowell County is a small county in West Virginia. It's probably produced more coal than just about any county in the United States. Might have lost it to Wyoming or Campbell County, Wyoming is in. But you know, after peaking in the 50s, it was one of the largest producers of coal in the U.S., and the county is now one of the poorest in West Virginia and the United States. So that boom bust economy in the state can also just lead to very uneven growth and huge effects on poverty, income, and a whole host of other demographic and indicators. Next slide, please. Another study that we looked at too in West Virginia is back in 2010, we conducted a report that looked at the impact of the boom and bust economy in West Virginia. And the goal of the report was really to ascertain the impact of energy booms and busts in the state. And we looked at a whole range of things, including income, employment, earnings, population, in order to explore why areas and places that had heavily concentrated energy production seemed to underperform places that had a much more diverse economy. And here's what we found. I mean, if you look at the chart there, you can say in the 1970s, when we had an energy boom, when the OPEC crisis was happening, those counties tend to do fairly well. So what this chart looks at is the difference between the state average in West Virginia and the top 10 counties that concentrated in mining. And what you find is during the energy boom, those counties tend to do really well. Then you have an energy bust, and they do a lot worse than the state as a whole and other counties that have a more diverse industry mix. And we found the same thing in the 2000 energy boom. So between 2003, 2011, for the most part, those counties tend to outperform the other counties in our state, except for the population. And that's really one of our case studies we did on Wetzel County. We found the same exact thing. We found pretty good economic growth comparatively, but we actually saw less people, so more people moving out of that area. In the latest energy bust, the same things have happened. Earnings are down, personal income are down, employment's down, population. A lot of this is tied into our decline of our coal industry in West Virginia, which has gone from about 160 million tons in 2008 to about a little over 85 million tons. So that's had a huge impact. But over the long haul, those counties tend to do a lot worse over this whole period. From 1970 to today, they are worse off than the counties that did not concentrate in coal mining. So that's one of the things that you find is this underperformance of those counties over the long run. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this is the report that we did, and it really looked at, we found that those counties had, the ones that concentrated in mining had a lower median household income, higher poverty, worse health outcomes, lower educational levels, and they were also more at risk or distressed according to the Appalachian Regional Commission. They had higher income inequality, and they were just far less diverse in terms of their industry structure. Next slide, please. And one reason for that lack of economic vitality is economic diversity. The ARC recently did a report looking at economic diversity in counties across Appalachia. And you can see there in that report that a lot of the counties, especially in West Virginia, are not very diverse. Whereas if you get right outside of Pittsburgh and some of those Pennsylvania counties, much more diverse economies, where if you get into southeast Ohio, those counties are also less diverse as well. And what that means is less stability. If you have a more diverse economy, you're less prone to the boom and bust cycle, you're more adaptability, your long-term growth is better, and this is what this study pointed out. But you can see that some of the areas are just quite different, but especially in Kentucky as well, a lot of mining counties, but clearly in West Virginia, it's a very undiverse economy, especially where a lot of this drilling is taking place in West Virginia and southeast Ohio. Next slide, please. So now that we've sort of identified the problem of the resource curse, the big question to a lot of policymakers and us was like, what can we do about it? And one way that we have looked at this over the last, 7 years now, is to look at creating a permanent natural resource trust fund. And these things can be called, different things in different places. Some people refer to them as sovereign wealth funds or severance tax trust funds. They have all different kinds of names, but what they are is just attempts by the government to convert. How do we convert a non-renewable natural resource, so oil, natural gas, coal, into wealth that's renewable for future generations? And these trust funds tend to be invested very similar to pension funds. So a portion of the fund is also, unlike a pension, well, somewhat like a pension fund, is used each year to financially bolster the state's economy through investments such as education, infrastructure, and tax relief in many of the states. And these funds are permanent because the principle of the fund is usually constitutionally protected or inviolate. This is often done through the state's constitution in most cases. So you can't raid that fund when you want to, and they make it very difficult to be able to do that. But these are some of the defining characteristics of those permanent funds. Next slide, please. And you can see that different states have different funds, and some are a lot bigger and a lot older than other ones. Some have been around for a good time. Most of them came around during the very first energy boom in the 1970s. So New Mexico's Severance Tax Permanent Fund has been around since, I believe, late 70s. The Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund has been around since the 70s, and the Texas University Fund and the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is probably the most famous one. They have about $61.5 billion in their fund right now. And one that's a little bit newer is the North Dakota Legacy Fund, which just started a couple years ago. Actually, I had the pleasure of going to North Dakota to learn about the Legacy Fund there. But they've been able to sock away about $5 billion so far. And a lot of these states also have land funds too. So there's a lot of different types of trust funds across the country, but these are ones that are just dedicated solely to revenues that are either leases or from a severance tax. Next slide, please. So why do states do this? We talked about how that they're permanent, they're inviolate, and how they use them and how they invest them in different ways, very much like a pension fund. A lot of states have rainy day funds, or what's called revenue stabilization funds. Actually, Louisiana just, I believe, approved one on their ballot. But I try to think of these as more like happy day funds, because the way the funds operate is they provide income off of the top. So if they earn interest 8-12% a year, they use a portion of that to fund basic needs. So in Wyoming, they take that portion of the fund, usually about 5% a year, and put it right back into their general revenue fund, which the biggest things in the general revenue fund in states are education, your public schools, higher education, and healthcare, mostly Medicaid, and your corrections. So they're just going right back into the state. In one case in Wyoming, they had a really big bust in the earlier 90s when Governor Sullivan was there. They used the trust fund that they had in Wyoming, the permanent fund, for about 20% of their budget one year, just because things got that bad. So it can provide a lot of stability to those states, and it's also a way to build those assets. Like, how do you convert a depleting finite resource into a renewable source of wealth for state programs and future generations? Because without that, the economic benefit from the natural resource extraction declines along with the natural resources themselves. And as I showed you, McDowell County is a prime example of that. Billions and billions of dollars of coal have come out of that county, and there's nothing left behind. And that's mainly because you often have economic growth in these areas, strong economic growth sometimes, but it's very limited and it's very time-oriented. But over the long run, there's not a lot of development, which those are just two very different things, and you end up with almost worse off later on down the road. So what these funds do is help you try to even out those booms and busts in the cycle. And they also, provide greater political leverage and autonomy for the areas. They can also help with the state's credit rating. So when Moody's and Standard & Fitch and these groups, Standard & Poor's, look at credit ratings for states, this is something they look at very closely, as very similar to a rainy day fund, to understand the fiscal capacity of the state in terms of bonding. So that's a really good thing to have. As Wendy talked about, the severance tax is a very highly exportable tax, and it has been shown to have very little impact on production because most of it is sent out of state. One good example of that is if you look at Alaska, for instance, with most of their revenue coming from the oil industry. I don't think anybody's thinking that Alaskans pay the tax themselves. So it's not really a tax responsibility borne by the citizens because it's largely pushed out of the state's economy and mostly falls on capital producers. Another thing that the severance tax can do is it helps build, helps lower future tax responsibilities. You'll find a lot of these states that actually have these funds, like Wyoming, Alaska, they don't have an income tax. They don't have other things, which Alaska is finding out the hard way that that's something that they need now because of what's happened up there. But they still have that very giant fund. Another thing, a lot of states, as Wendy talked about, the Iron Range in Minnesota have used funds similar to this to help diversify and expand their local economies, to invest in human capital and infrastructure, and to help mitigate some of the externalities involved in this. So I would say that there's really not a state in this country that does a great job at that, of using their fund to really diversify their economy. In Montana, they have the Big Sky Economic Development Fund that they use, that Montana uses with their trust fund. That's a pretty small amount, but they do try to use that for economic development in the region to help diversify the economy. It's one of the few states that uses their trust fund to do that. But a lot of the states, it just goes right into the General Revenue Fund, which is not a bad use of the money as well. Next slide, please. And over the course of the last couple of years, a lot of people have been getting a lot more interested in these trust funds, especially with the shale development that's been happening on the East Coast and in other areas. So the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment has put out a report along with the Brookings policy program in Washington, D.C., and they've set out some examples of like what are sort of best practices for funds when you're setting these up. What are the objectives of them and what can you do? What are the fiscal rules for deposit and withdrawal? This is sort of getting down into the nitty-gritty of how they actually function and what the technical aspects are. But a lot of the funds, they have pretty broad investment rules. Some are a little bit more risky. Some are end up being invested pretty similar to pension funds and other funds that the state operates. But there needs to be like a very good division of responsibilities between the ultimate authority of the fund manager, the day-to-day operation manager, and the different offices within them. And a lot of the states, it's run through the state treasurer's office, but they tend to be usually have a lot of transparency involved. Alaska, they farm theirs out to the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation. If you go onto their website, it's very good. And they're very transparent with board meetings and letting people know that this is their investment, that this money belongs to them. So having that strong independent oversight body to look at behavior, look at rules, and the biggest fear is that they get spent down. In a lot of states, like North Dakota is a prime example, they've set up funds like this before and they've just drained them. In North Dakota's example, property tax relief, they used it for that. But the important thing is if you're going to do this, you really need to make sure it's inviolate, that it's constitutionally protected, and that you can't just rate it whenever you're feeling like you need to. Next slide, please. And the next slide just provides sort of some more detailed information on the aspects of the fund, how much money goes into it, when they were created, the market value of the funds. Some of this information is a little old, but they give you some more idea of what the asset allocation is in the fund, how they use the earnings. Like Alaska uses for dividends, they get checks from $1,000 to $2,000. But a lot of the states just use it for general revenue fund, education, infrastructure, and some use it for economic development. So there's all different ways to do this, but the important part is that they're building assets over the long term that can stay within the state and that they can use them to help benefit the people that are in that state. Because if you don't do that, you just end up with a loss of wealth. And I think the important part is to make sure that you're reinvesting that money back into those communities as a good strategic investment for the state to do that, to help diversify the economy and help really mitigate that boom and bust cycle. So most of these funds are created, through a public vote, like I talked about. Some are a little different, but most of them are constitutionally protected, and that helps ensure that the public feels secure in what they've done. But it also helps you plan for the future. Probably the most famous example, too, of funds, at least internationally, is Norway and their pension fund. They have over $1 trillion in that fund, which is just an amazing amount of money since they've had it since the the mid-1990s. And that's a lot of money per person, and it's over $100,000 per person in the country of Norway. And they're probably one of the very few countries that has been able to avoid this resource curse. But this is just one tool in the toolbox to be able to provide for the future and invest it. But as states look forward to how to do this, I think it's really important to get the public buy-in, to be transparent, to set up rules, to think over the long term of having the fund, and also to use it very strategically and use it in the things that really provide a really good return on investment, like early childhood education or customized workforce job training, a whole host of things that can provide a good bang for the buck. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions at any point.
All right, thank you very much, Ted. And now we're going to turn it over to our final speaker of the day, Daniel Raymond.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Thank you in particular to Alyssa and Dan and Jonathan for organizing, and to Wendy and Ted for your presentations. I am going to talk about some research that I've been involved with over the last several years that looks closely at these questions, and I maybe offer a slightly different perspective based on some of that work. So I am a senior research associate at Resources for the Future. RFF is an independent nonprofit research institution in Washington, D.C. We've been around for 65 years, a little over 65 years, in fact. And RFF's mission is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement. And we have a variety of efforts going on related to oil and gas development, energy development, climate change, and a whole host of other issues. I'll be talking today about a project that I've been involved in called the Shale Public Finance Project. It's been supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. Part of it was carried out at Duke University, while myself and the other investigator were both at Duke and now at RFF. As I mentioned, my collaborator on this project is Richard Newell, who is the president and CEO of RFF, as well as myself. So again, just a little more background on this project, and then I'll get into the results, which I think are quite pertinent for today's discussion. The objective of this project was, given the fact that oil and gas development has increased dramatically in the US over the last 10 years or so, we wanted to see how that development has affected local governments and their ability to provide services. Of course, the ability to provide services depends very heavily on how revenues are managed, both at the state, local, and to some extent, national levels. So we wanted to look closely at those questions. And of course, we wanted to understand what lessons we could learn based on looking at a broad swath of the US. So what we did to try to accomplish those goals is we examined every major onshore oil and gas producing region in the United States. In total, we looked at 21 regions in 16 different states. I'll show you a map in a couple slides of where exactly we went. And part of this work was focused on looking at, again, how local governments have been impacted. So to get at that information, the first thing we did was we did structured interviews with over 250 local public officials from a broad range of governments. And we looked very closely at state and local fiscal policies, as well as looking very closely at local government budgets, state budgets. And in order to look at many local government budgets, as I'm sure many of you know, whether they be small townships or counties or municipalities, particularly in rural areas, you can't access those data very easily online. So what you need to do is you need to go there. As a result, I ended up racking up a pretty good amount of frequent flyer miles, traveling to all of these places that you see on the map in order to first interview local government officials, and second, to gather some of these fiscal data that you simply can't get without going to the offices and digging through dusty folders in the back of the room. So as you can see, we've looked at a really broad range of places. This map shows oil and gas permitting activity in February 2015. It would look a little bit different today, but it basically gives you an idea of where most oil and gas development is occurring in the United States, and has really occurred over the last 5 to 10 years or so. But as you can see, we looked at a variety of locations that vary along a variety of characteristics. And this is really important because one of the things that we learned over the course of this research is that every region, every state, they have their own local dynamics. It's maybe an obvious point, but it was borne out quite clearly in our research. So the issues that come up in Kern County, California, for example, are different from the issues that come up in Eastern Ohio and the Utica Shale. The issues along the North Slope of Alaska Alaska are very different from the issues in the Barnett Shale region of Texas. Maybe that's an obvious point, as I said, but I think it helps us understand how different policies might be appropriate in different places. So what I'm going to talk about today is not the results of the interviews with local government officials, but instead I'm going to focus on what we found in terms of how oil and gas revenues are collected and allocated across the 16 different states that we looked at. So what we did is to really do an apples to apples comparison across states. You need to look at severance taxes, which has been the focus of the discussion so far today, but there are other really important revenues for governments that are derived from oil and gas. First, there are oil and gas leases on federal lands. That's particularly important in western states. There are state leases, state oil and gas leases on state lands, such as in state parks or state forests, and these are important revenue sources for a number of states. There are severance taxes, of course, that we've been focused on today. And then there are property taxes, which are levied by local governments and are an extremely important revenue source for many local governments in the states that we looked at. So what we do is we quantify each of those 4 revenue streams for all the states. And if we ask the question, for every dollar of revenue from oil and gas production, what percentage flows from these 4 sources? It's worth noting that there are other revenue sources that are out there, like sales taxes and income taxes, that are important and do drive revenue for local and state governments. But because of some of the quantification challenges around that Wendy sort of alluded to in her presentation, it can be difficult to estimate those with any precision. So we decided not to try to quantify those sources, but I do want to point out that they are important revenue drivers for local and state governments. So here's kind of a summary figure of what we found. This figure shows the percentage of oil and gas revenue that's collected by state and local governments from the 4 mechanisms that I mentioned. So in blue, you can see severance taxes. In red, local property taxes. In gray, revenue from oil and gas leases on federal lands. And in purple, revenue from oil and gas leases on state lands. And what stands out here to me is the diversity of policies that exist. And this diversity of policies actually tells you a lot about the resources of the particular state. It tells you a lot about the history of the particular state, and the political dynamics of the particular state. And for today's audience, we see that Ohio is on the bottom end of revenue collection from oil and gas development. In total, in 2013, which is the year we gathered data for, Ohio collected about 0.5% of oil and gas revenue from its severance tax and about 0.5% from local property taxes. That's quite a bit lower than any other state that we looked at. Now, the implications of that finding are not necessarily straightforward, as I'll talk about towards the conclusion. Another important question that, again, we've been talking about today, both Ted and Wendy touched on, is that states use these revenues for a variety of purposes, and states have different priorities. Some states might use their oil and gas revenues to fund current expenditures at the state government level. Some states put revenue into trust funds, as Ted was focusing on, where states can save for future government operations. Some states channel a large proportion of revenue to education expenditures, both primary and secondary education. And some states, like Texas, squirrel away a substantial amount of revenue in trust funds that are dedicated for educational purposes. Finally, local governments both collect revenue from oil and gas development and receive allocations of revenue from the state level to help them manage some of the externalities that Wendy and Ted were talking about. So we, again, quantified these 5 different revenue flows. And what I'm going to show you now is a figure that is very similar to the last figure, but instead of looking at the mechanism through which revenue was collected, such as severance taxes or property taxes, this chart shows where the revenue goes. So here we see in blue, dark blue, those are revenues that fund current state expenditures. In the shaded blue area, the lighter blue, those are revenues that go directly to state trust funds. In brown, we see revenue that goes directly to current education expenditures, so annual school budgets, things like that. And in the shaded brown area, that's revenue that goes to education trust funds. The green area is revenue that flows to local governments, such as counties, townships, and cities in these different states. So again, you see a wide diversity in how states use revenue. And in terms of trust funds, which has been a large focus today, we again see that North Dakota, New Mexico, Wyoming, to a lesser extent Texas, and certainly Alaska are major funders of long-term trust funds to support their economies for the inevitable day when oil and gas production either declines or goes away entirely. Now, I'm going to talk about the implications, again, of these different choices in just a moment. But before that, I want to show you a few neat graphs, which are called Sankey diagrams. I'm going to show you, I believe, 3 of these that just illustrate how a few different states collect and allocate revenue. On the left-hand side of this figure, you can see the source of revenue for, in this case, North Dakota. What this figure shows you is that on the left side of the screen, North Dakota collected about $2.4 billion from oil and gas production, which was about 9.8% of the value of oil and gas produced in the state in fiscal year 2013. You can follow those blue lines over to the right-hand side of the figure and see that North Dakota allocated about 1/3 of that revenue to local governments, about 1/3 to a state trust fund, and about 1/3 to current state government expenditures. North Dakota also generated some pretty substantial revenue from oil leases on its state lands, and most of that revenue flows directly to an education trust fund. So here we can see that, revenue is used in different ways by North Dakota, and they've actually altered their revenue allocation policies quite a bit in the last couple of years, largely to channel additional revenue to local governments, which were having a hard time managing some of the boomtown effects that, again, Ted and Wendy mentioned in rural western North Dakota. Here's another state, and just a quick look at how they collect and allocate revenue. Pennsylvania, just across the border from Ohio. The impact fee in Pennsylvania generated $226 million in 2013. That was about 2.3% of the value of production. Most of that revenue flowed to local governments, and a smaller portion flowed to state current expenditures. The state also generated a substantial amount of revenue from oil and gas leasing on state lands. That revenue flowed directly to state current expenditures. Now, this is an interesting structure in Pennsylvania because it really does prioritize local governments and the impacts that they experience. One of the things that we found in our research is that local governments in Pennsylvania have pretty much uniformly experienced net fiscal benefits from oil and gas development. So even though they have experienced some of the challenges that Ted and Wendy talked about, the revenues that they've seen from the impact fee have more than offset those direct costs. Now, that doesn't address some of the concerns about externalities such as air pollution or concerns about water contamination, but at least when we're thinking about local government's ability to provide services, they seem to have benefited pretty substantially from Marcellus development. Finally, Ohio, and we have figures like this for all 16 states that we did, but I didn't want to bore you with all of them. Ohio, as we can see, the severance tax flows directly to state current expenditures, and property taxes flow to schools, local school districts, as well as local governments like counties and municipalities. So this is a fairly common structure in terms of how governments collect and allocate revenue, but the simple level of revenue collected is substantially lower than we saw in any other state. The percentage of oil and gas revenue that is collected by the state, again, just a little over 1%, is substantially lower than anywhere else we saw. Now, I do want to point out that I looked at some of the data from 2016, fiscal year 2016, and I wasn't able to make a new figure, but revenue collections were up substantially in Ohio, unsurprisingly because of the growth in production. The percentage share of severance tax is about the same. It's still around 0.5%, but the percentage share of revenue from property taxes has grown quite a bit. And so today, in 2016, the total amount of revenue collected by Ohio state and local governments was not 1% as it was in 2013, but in 2016, it was closer to 1.7%. In total, it was about $68 million, according to some sort of back of the envelope calculations that I did. I also want to point out that in Ohio, the interviews we did with local governments suggested that they, like their neighbors in Pennsylvania, were for the most part experiencing net fiscal benefits from oil and gas development. That is, the revenues they were taking in were more than enough to deal with the challenges they were experiencing in terms of public services. Now, part of the reason for that is in Pennsylvania, as well as in Ohio, there are widespread road use and maintenance agreements, sometimes called RUMAs or RMAs, between township governments, which maintain local roads, and oil and gas operators. So when these RMAs are in place, it really eases the fiscal burden off of local governments for things like road repair. Those RMAs don't exist in many states, but they are very prevalent in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and that's been quite beneficial for the local governments in that region. So now just two more slides of a little context, a little analysis, and then some conclusions. So one of the obvious points from this presentation is that Ohio collects less direct oil and gas revenue than any other major producing state. That includes severance taxes, but it also includes property taxes and other major oil and gas revenue sources. As Wendy and Ted have alluded to, most academic research suggests that moderate severance taxes will not have a large effect on private investment decisions. So increasing the severance tax rate by a couple percentage points is unlikely to, completely decimate an industry in a given state. Of course, it will have some effect. Any increase in taxes will have some marginal effect on investment decisions. The question is it big or small? And most research suggests that moderate severance taxes have only small effects on investment decisions. But one point I wanted to make is that more revenue flowing to governments, be they state governments or local governments, does not necessarily enhance wealth retention. That's partly because the private benefits of shale development have been very large. The presentations we've heard today have been focused on public allocation of funds, public collection of funds, and that's a really important component of the story. But we shouldn't forget about the private wealth retention and enhancement that has been generated by the Utica shale development. And this is something we've seen around the country, where revenues from oil and gas leases, increased employment, and other effects have been very positive for local economies. They have been quite volatile, as Wendy and Ted have discussed, but nonetheless, they have been positive. So now thinking a little bit about public funds and savings trust funds, in regions that are extremely heavily dependent on energy extraction, building public funds makes a lot of sense to mitigate busts. In places like Alaska, North Dakota in recent years, and Wyoming for decades, reliance on volatile energy revenues means that building up a substantial cushion will allow you to smooth out the inevitable booms and busts of the industry. And that's smart policy. But in other states, developing a large trust fund might not actually be the right approach. And if you look at California or Colorado, for example, these are two large oil and gas producing states. They don't really do much in the way of collecting trust funds, and that's primarily because those states have large and diverse economies. So a boom and bust in the oil and gas industry doesn't mean a boom and bust for the entire economy. And I put Ohio in there with a question mark because clearly the Utica Shale region, southeastern Ohio, has seen a large impact from Utica shale development, but is it on the scale of something that we see on the North Slope of Alaska or Western North Dakota or parts of Wyoming? And based on our research, it seems to me that the scale of the boom in Ohio is not equivalent to the scale of the boom in some of these other places. So the last slide, again, maybe an obvious point, but states have different approaches to tax policy based on their history, their economic structures, their political dynamics, and that makes sense. It's appropriate for states to take different approaches based on their own individual needs. The larger the boom, the more challenges arise related to economic diversification. Ohio as a whole has not boomed like North Dakota, but some regions certainly have been heavily affected. I want to make the point quickly here about the idea of the natural resource curse. Ted talked quite a bit about it, and if you dig into the economics literature on the natural resource curse, you actually find mixed evidence as to whether or not the natural resource curse exists and whether it exists in the United States. Certainly there are examples where countries and individual states have substantially benefited from the presence of natural resources. There are also examples where states and countries have struggled because of their dependence on natural resources. So I would just simply make the point that the natural resource curse is not inevitable and it is not ubiquitous. So finally, in a case like Ohio, based on our research, what I would suggest is that a preferred fiscal policy probably wouldn't focus on the state level because the state as a whole is economically diverse. The types of revenues that you would generate from a higher severance tax would be quite small relative to total state government revenues. But it does make sense to think hard about local and regional fiscal policy and how to strengthen the private sector as well as the public sector for southeastern Ohio as it deals with Utica shale development. Now finally, a shameless plug for my book, which is called The Fracking Debate. It comes out in a few weeks, but you can pre-order it now on Amazon if you're so inclined. It's a book that's in part based on the travels that I've done to all of these different parts of the United States, as well as analyses of many of the different questions related to shale development, including water issues and earthquakes and air pollution and economic impacts and all that stuff. So I'd encourage you to check it out. And I'd encourage you to email me if you have questions, and please see the website listed at the bottom here if you would like to look at any of the publications that I referenced in today's presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. So we have approximately 15 minutes left for a Q&A session that I will be moderating. If you have any, if the audience has any questions, please use the question pane on your GoToWebinar. I will be collecting those and then asking questions back out to our panelists. So I would like to address the first question to Wendy and then also Ted. So Wendy, you had mentioned that the Policy Matters Ohio is a 5% severance tax. Daniel had discussed a moderate tax, does not seem to have a lot of, has some marginal impact, but not a large fleeing of the industry. Would you consider a 5% tax a reasonable tax with respect to your perspective on the industry? And then to follow up on that question, Ted, you had talked about this 5-state collaboration, thinking about harmonizing policy. Do you have any insight into kind of what floor type of rates they're talking about? Is 5% in the discussion of a floor? Is that something higher or lower than that? So Wendy, if you can, would you be able to address the first part? And then we'll turn to Ted.
Thank you, Dr. Carney. Yes, we think 5% is a reasonable severance tax rate. This is the rate that the industry pays in West Virginia. And the industry is not restricted by state boundaries. The 5% severance tax in West Virginia has not discouraged drilling there. We believe that it is necessary to establish a level playing field across Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio so that the industry does not play our states off against each other. So 5% we think is a reasonable amount. We also believe that in the long run, the Utica and Marcellus shale that underlies Ohio is a very productive shale play, and that establishing a permanent fund now is a wise investment for the state to make and could yield over time an important source for possibly for higher education or possibly for economic development in the long run without endangering the industry. This would be a fee that would be levied on top of the 5% severance tax for a permanent fund. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Wendy. Ted, do you know of any particular floor number that this that the 5-state collaboration has been talking about, or is it more of a less defined numerically at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that Daniel might have talked about too was the fact that I mean, there's not a really great amount of academic research on the severance tax. There's one scholar, Shelby Kirkling, is one of the few that actually has really analyzed it. But I think just looking at West Virginia and the surrounding region, you make a hell of a case to say that West Virginia has been hurt because it's had a 5% severance tax. Or just if you want to look at the whole basket of taxes, West Virginia also has a local natural gas severance tax. It's a property tax. It's kind of complicated, but they use an income approach. But it brings in about $110 million a year on top of the severance tax, actually a little bit higher. And if you look at other states like Wyoming, I mean, their biggest severance tax is their local production tax. It's not their state severance tax. It's their local. It's over $1 billion on all minerals. So I think you have a really hard case to make that I think even doubling the severance tax wouldn't hurt things too much. And a good case to show that is the fact that the gas prices have gone down dramatically and production's boomed. So you see gas prices going down all over 100%. I mean, there's a lot of room there, and there's a lot of rent that isn't being captured. I don't know any state that's ever lost money because they had too high of a severance tax.
All right, this is another question for Ted. You had mentioned, you had showed a spread of all the different types of fund, kind of wealth funds that are around, and that the last slide of your presentation. If you had to pick one right now, as is from that list, and impose it in West Virginia, do you know which one it would be?
Well, if Alaska, that you didn't deduct they weren't able to deduct things from their severance tax. So theirs is obviously the biggest. I think the dividend approach is questionable, whether that's a great idea. I actually think Wyoming has been slow and steady, and they have used theirs strategically for their general revenue fund, which is a good bang for the buck too. Public education, healthcare, higher education, that's a good use for it. They've created a fund in Wyoming, named after, I think, a former governor. They used a portion of it to create a fund. And they've used it very well, and it's built up, and they've invested it well, and it's grown at a pretty good rate in terms of the corpus of the fund. So I would probably choose Wyoming. I think dedicating 1 full percent or 2% to a trust fund of the severance tax, a 1 percentage point, is a good way to go.
All right, thank you. This one is for Daniel Ramey. You had mentioned you talked about, are we as concerned with boom and bust cycles in larger states like Ohio or California or something like that? And I was wondering what your thoughts were on within state variation. I know you had mentioned that again slightly at the end, but would the idea of having something like a trust fund for a part of the state or sending it out to the counties or something like that, would that be a way to kind of mitigate this with in-state variation in boom bust?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and I was actually thinking about that a little bit as I was preparing today's presentation. I'm not aware of any trust funds either at national levels or in any U.S. states that are focused on particular regions of the state. I think there are probably kind of clear political reasons why that would be a heavy lift in any state legislature. But I think the approach is one worth thinking about, and depending on sort of local fiscal policy in terms of how much revenue how much revenue county governments and local governments are able to save and sort of pool together, it might be something worth exploring in some detail. Because as you implied, if we think about the entire state of Ohio, it's hard to see how the revenues generated by Utica development would yield the types of major benefits for future generations. But if we're thinking about kind of the Utica Shale in particular, then I think you could have more of an impact there with some regional savings funds and regional economic development efforts.
Great. I'm going to stick with you for a minute. We noticed there was a lot of very interesting cross-state variation in both the collection mechanism and the distribution mechanisms of these revenue streams. In your sense, from your on-the-ground experience, what is kind of the major driver of this cross-state variation? Is it history? Is it geography? Is it luck? What is your sense of qualitative sense of the main driver of this large variation?
Yeah, it's sort of, I think it varies depending on the revenue mechanism that we're thinking about. And I could probably talk for like 2 hours to answer your question, and no one would want to hear that. But I guess a couple examples would be, one of the important components is the quality of the resource. So in Alaska, for example, we have a very high severance tax because the resource is so large and because it's so remote. Wendy talked a bit about sunk costs. Once those sunk costs were in place on the North Slope of Alaska, then it's hard, there's no way that the industry is going to abandon that quickly. And so there's probably more room for governments to impose higher tax rates. When we think about property taxes, that seems to be a function of history. Some states, including Pennsylvania, North Dakota, Montana, they do not allow their local governments to tax oil and gas as property. And I don't know the details of all the history around that, but it is something that is a historical factor. And then in terms of revenue allocation, the best example that comes to mind is when you look at Western states and how they use revenue for education trust funds in particular. There was legislation, federal legislation in the late 1800s that required state governments in the American West to use the natural resource revenues generated on state lands for advancing education systems in perpetuity. So the federal government essentially required those Western states to use oil and gas revenues from state lands to advance education. The reason the federal government could do that is because the federal government ceded much of those state lands to those states, and so it was one of the requirements. So those are just a few examples of how different factors can drive these policies. Another important component is, of course, local tax rates, so local property tax rates. Ted mentioned Wyoming. You see, major oil and gas revenues from local property taxes in Wyoming, and that's partly due to, they just have slightly higher tax rates and tax bases in those regions as well.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to circle back to Wendy. So I had kicked off this Q&A by asking you about this 5% rate, and that's on the kind of collection mechanism side. Do you and Policy Managers Ohio have any particular number or percentage breakdown that you would like to see on the distribution side? So Daniel had talked a lot about going back to the local state level, or do you prefer more to state budget kind of current expenditure type of elements? So what are your thoughts on those revenue distribution mechanism percentages, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you. We do not have a set position on that. Generally, we have backed what the region has asked for as the various plans have come up in the legislature. We do not believe that all of the severance tax should go just to the region. We believe it should be a statewide severance tax with allocations focused on particular needs and uses within the region. So we aren't locked in, and I think that the some in the region want 100%. We think that's unwise for several reasons. One of them being, when we look at the local impact fee in Pennsylvania, when there's a boom, that boom can blow the local public finances out of the water, and a lot of that money gets given back in tax breaks. That's one place we think that the severance tax should not go. It should not go towards cutting, as our governor has suggested, the income tax or other taxes. It should go for enhancing services and paying for the external cost of production within the affected region. That said, we do not have a percentage.
Great. So I'm going to do a quick final around the horn question here. We'll start with Ted and then go to Daniel and back to Wendy if she has any final thoughts. So this is a current events question. There's a lot of debate right now in Washington on federal tax policy, in particular how that would impact research and development credits and expensing of capital investment and lots of other very complicated pieces. I don't know if any of you guys have been following this, but I just wanted to go around the horn and see if there's any particular thoughts on this federal tax shakeup vis-a-vis shale development and growth. So we'll start with Ted, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I know that they're eliminating the SALT. It's been a lot of the state and local tax deduction. I can't recall exactly if it falls on businesses too, but one of the attractive features of having a severance tax is, at least in our state, it is deductible as a business expense on your state and local, on your federal taxes, if you owe any. So that's an attractive feature, and if that's taken away, that could make it more difficult, obviously, to enact a severance tax.
All right, great. Daniel?
It's a great question, and I don't have any deep insight because I haven't studied the tax bill closely. But I guess my kind of overarching thought is I've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple of years about the Trump administration and how their policies might affect oil and gas production in particular. And my general response to that is that technology and prices are really the things to watch. Tax policy matters, but at the federal level, when we're talking about the oil and gas industry, we need to think about prices and technologies, and those are not driven by Washington.
Great. And Wendy, do you have any thoughts on this?
We are still studying this tax bill. We've looked primarily at the impact on individuals and families. As the corporate tax rates come down, clearly the deductibility of the severance tax is less effective for the industry. We're also looking closely, we will in the near future, look closely at the impact of the pass-through deduction, which has been disastrous on revenues here in Ohio, where we have a similar issue. It may have a bearing on certain forms of investment in wells in Southeast Ohio, and we aren't clear what that may be. So we are still looking at that closely.
All right, great. Thank you very much. We are right about out of time. Again, to our panelists, Wendy, Ted, and Daniel, we appreciate your deep insights today. And thank you to the audience for all of your participation. This will be this is being recorded and will be posted on the CE3 website. And look forward to announcements for future webinars and our Shale Symposium in the spring. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.